Chapter 6. Go on with your oppressions. "I am for Negro suffrage in every rebel state," said Thaddeus Stevens in the House of Representatives on January 3, 1867. "If it be just, it should not be denied. If it be necessary, it should be adopted. If it be a punishment to traitors, they deserve it." Stevens' speech was on behalf of a bill with a new plan for reconstructing ex-Confederate states. "Unless the rebel states, before admission, should be made Republican in spirit and placed under the guardianship of loyal men," Stevens warned, "all our blood and treasure will have been spent in vain." While debate on that bill continued, Congress remained on the move. On January 8th, it gave the vote to all male residents of the District of Columbia 21 years of age and older. Exceptions included men who had aided the rebellion. Congress was just getting started. Over President Johnson's veto on March 2, 1867, the bill Thaddeus Stevens championed in January became law. Known as the First Reconstruction Act and as the Military Reconstruction Act, it ushered in congressional reconstruction in opposition to Johnson's previous measures under presidential reconstruction. The Joint Committee on Reconstruction had concluded that in their present condition, former rebel states, except for Tennessee, were not entitled to be in the Union. Under the First Reconstruction Act, 10 Confederate states were declared conquered territory. They were put under military rule in 5 districts. Commanders of military districts were charged with protecting all people's rights and crushing all violence and disorders. These commanders had oversight over the election of delegates, black men to be among them, to new state constitutional conventions. The new constitutions had to give black men the right to vote, and Congress had to approve those new constitutions. What's more, no state would be restored to the Union until it ratified the 14th Amendment, which Tennessee did back in the summer of 1866. A total of about 20,000 troops were stationed in these districts. Military District Number 1, Virginia. Military District Number 2, North and South Carolina. Military District Number 3, Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. Military District Number 4, Arkansas and Mississippi. Military District Number 5, Louisiana and Texas. While legions of white Southerners felt trampled upon and only saw miserable, dark days ahead, millions of blacks were full of hope. Finally, they would have a voice. Finally, they would be able to put forth their vision of the nation's remaking. Congress further fostered that hope when, on March 23rd, and again over Johnson's veto, it passed the Second Reconstruction Act. For one, this law put the military commanders of the 5 districts in charge of elections, starting with voter registration. In July 1867, Congress passed the Third Reconstruction Act. Among other things, it empowered district commanders to remove people from office. Black participation in state constitutional conventions varied. Take Alabama's, held in Montgomery, November 5th through December 6, 1867. Although about 45% of its population was black in 1860, of its convention's 100 delegates, only 18 were black. However, nearly 80 of its white delegates were Republicans. Of the 169 delegates to Georgia's convention, December 9, 1867, to March 11, 1868, 37 were black, although black people composed approximately 45% of the population in 1860. One student of Reconstruction, retired Marine Corps Colonel Samuel Taylor, nevertheless called the delegates a most remarkable group, adding that it was more representative of the state as a whole than any other elected body in the history of Georgia, and embodied a dramatic shift from antebellum Georgia, where the port city of Savannah and the great coastal planters were the economic and political power center. South Carolina's Constitutional Convention in Charleston, which commenced on January 14, 1868, and closed on March 17th, had the highest percentage of black representatives. More than 70 of its 124 delegates were of African descent. Black people made up about 60% of the population in 1860. I remarked in a former letter that the colored men in the convention possessed by long odds the largest share of mental caliber. wrote New York Times correspondent Q in late January 1868 of the South Carolina Convention. They are the best debaters. Some of them are peculiarly apt in raising and sustaining points of order. There is a homely but strong grasp of common sense in what they say. These delegates included the formerly enslaved Union veterans Prince Rivers and Robert Smalls. The new state constitution these black men and their white colleagues drafted was quite enlightened and progressive for both black and white people. It included public assistance for the elderly, the poor, and the disabled, ended debtor's prison, and no longer required an office holder to be a property owner. South Carolina's new constitution also established mandatory free public schooling for all, though sadly, it would be years before this went into effect. Robert Smalls was among the delegates who really pushed for free public schools. He also advocated women's suffrage. All in all, of the roughly 1,000 delegates to state conventions in 10 former Confederate states, more than 25% were black men. Artisans, farmers, owners of restaurants and grocery stores, some had been born free, others had been formerly enslaved. They proved just how wrong the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, and his supporters had been. Black people were fit to govern themselves. It was a watershed moment in America. In the summer of 1868, the 14th Amendment became part of the Constitution, and 7 ex-Confederate states were back in the Union: Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and both Carolinas. Virginia and Mississippi had new constitutions, but their citizens had not yet ratified them. Texas's convention was still underway. Historian Eric Foner estimates that under congressional Reconstruction, some 2,000 black men were elected or appointed to public office. They were mayors, marshals, school superintendents, postmasters, city council members, justices of the peace, police officers, sheriffs, state treasurers, state legislators. 16 served in the U.S. Congress. Those congressmen included Hiram Revels, born free in North Carolina. On February 25, 1870, this minister and educator who made Mississippi home after the war would become the nation's first black U.S. senator. Also in the 1870s, the freeborn pastor of Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and newspaper editor Richard H. Kane would serve 2 non-consecutive terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. The heroic Robert Smalls would also become a national lawmaker. After representing Beaufort in South Carolina's Senate and House of Representatives, Smalls would serve 5 non-consecutive terms in the U.S. House of Representatives. In Graham, North Carolina, Wyatt Outlaw had a say in the running of the local government when he became a town commissioner. Prince Rivers was a member of the South Carolina House of Representatives, representing Edgefield County, then Aiken County, which he co-founded with 2 other black men in 1871. Rivers was also a major general in the Palmetto State's National Guard, and, for a time, head of Aiken's Republican Party. Yet another black man on the rise during Reconstruction was James Lynch, who had been at that meeting in Savannah with General Sherman and Secretary of War Stanton. Lynch started schools there and made a stirring speech during the Black Convention in Nashville in August 1865. Lynch made history as the first black person to hold a major political office in Mississippi when he was elected its Secretary of State in 1869. Along with gains, there were losses. On September 3, 1868, the Georgia House of Representatives, dominated by white Republicans, voted to expel 25 of its black members. 4 retained their seats because, as historian John Hope Franklin explained, their fair complexion made it impossible to prove that they were black. Go on with your oppressions. Babylon fell. Where is Greece? Where is Nineveh? And where is Rome, the mistress empire of the world? Why is it that she stands today in the broken fragments throughout Europe? Because oppression killed her. Every act that we commit is like a bounding ball. If you curse a man, that curse rebounds upon you. And when you bless a man, the blessing returns to you. And when you oppress a man, the oppression also will rebound. Georgia state senator and one of the most dynamic AME ministers, Henry McNeill Turner, on September 3, 1868. Turner, educated at Baltimore's Trinity College, had been born free in South Carolina. A few days after the Georgia House of Representatives' odious act, the Georgia Senate ejected its 3 black members. Had these men committed crimes? Had they failed to do their duty? No. They were expelled on the grounds that the new state constitution did not expressly state that black men could hold office. This was 44 days after Congress readmitted the Peach State to the Union. The ousted Georgia lawmakers included Reverend Henry McNeill Turner, who had been appointed as the first black chaplain during the Civil War, Tunis G. Campbell, and Philip Joyner. Shortly after their expulsion, Joyner led hundreds of black people and a few of their white allies on a protest march of more than 20 miles from Albany to Camilla for a political rally. When the marchers reached Camilla's courthouse, whites fired upon them, killing about a dozen and wounding possibly 30 others, according to the New Georgia Encyclopedia. In March 1869, Congress refused to seat Georgia senators and representatives. At year's end, Congress put Georgia back under military rule. Black office holders who served their communities, their cities, their states, and their nation did so at great peril. Some found it necessary to have bodyguards. The Ku Klux Klan, the Pale Faces, the Knights of the White Camellias, the White League, the White Brotherhood, the Red Shirts. These are just some of the white supremacist paramilitary organizations that emerged during Reconstruction. Men determined to take their states back by any means necessary. On the night of February 26, 1870, a bleak and rainy night. "Oh, Daddy! Oh, Daddy!" cried Wyatt Outlaw's 6-year-old son, Oscar. A gang of 60 or more Klansmen had marched by torchlight to the outlaw home, then battered down the front door. Once inside, they knocked Wyatt Outlaw's mother to the floor and proceeded to kick and stomp this woman in her 70s. With Outlaw in their clutches, they dragged the 50-year-old widower from his house and beat him as they made their way to an elm tree. They strung Wyatt Outlaw up on a branch that faced the courthouse. A sign affixed to his chest read, "Beware, ye guilty parties, both white and black." Wyatt Outlaw's martyrdom was not in vain. After being ratified on February 3rd, on March 30th, 1870, the 15th Amendment became part of the Constitution. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, said the amendment with no mention of sex. The amendment also stated that Congress had the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Also on that day, Texas gained readmission to the Union. Virginia had gained its readmission in late January, and Mississippi in late February. In July 1870, Georgia would be back in the Union too. Now what? With the Union back together, with African Americans bona fide citizens, with black men possessing the vote, the right by which all others could be secured, as Frederick Douglass once said, would the nation now move forward? Would progressive ideals prevail? The Great Obstruction. Radical Republicans wanted Andrew Johnson out. They stayed on the lookout for grounds for impeaching the president, whom they called the Great Obstruction. They saw their chance when Johnson fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton on February 21, 1868, for his allegiance to radicals in Congress. Within days, the House voted to impeach the president. The House came up with 11 articles of impeachment. Most stemmed from the Stanton affair. Chiefly, Johnson was charged with violating the March 1867 Tenure of Office Act, which Congress had passed in order to bar the president from firing certain office holders. Another charge pertained to the president hurling insults at Congress in public. The trial of Andrew Johnson, the first U.S. president to be impeached, began on March 5, 1868, and lasted until mid-May, when the Senate failed to convict Johnson by 1 vote. Ohio's Ben Wade was a factor. After Johnson became president, the United States had no vice president, the person who presides over the Senate. Ben Wade had been elected president pro tempore, that is, for a time, of the Senate. If Johnson were thrown out of office, Wade would become president of the United States, and he was too radical for many moderates in Congress. Legions of white Southerners hooted and hollered over Johnson's acquittal. Some Southern skies were alive with fireworks. Many Republicans in the South made themselves scarce as violent winds whipped up. One Republican in Florida predicted even darker days ahead in a letter to a colleague up north. News of the failure to convict Johnson will be like Greek fire throughout the entire South. May God save our country from the consuming conflagration.